This afternoon, we have a very interesting moderator. Those of you who are interested in the school problem know what he has done in heading the drive for the establishment of private schools to get away from the government school control of the children and see that they get back to good basic American teaching. And you will notice in the programs that on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday mornings, he and your wife, I believe, will be conducting a seminar on how to establish and operate a Christian school. So there is an opportunity for you to find out what they are doing to help in this struggle of ours. And we're glad to have them here, and especially glad to be able to present him to this audience as a whole in a role of moderator. And I will present him to you immediately, Mr. Robert Thoburn.
Thank you, Colonel Bunker. When I was asked to introduce Mr. Ed Rowe, I said I certainly know him very well. His daughter Debbie lived with us for about a semester, and I've known Ed for quite a long time and the work that they are doing. And so it is a real privilege to introduce him today. Now, he told me that he liked short introductions, and I was curious as to why they chose a minister to introduce him. Sort of reminds me of the story about this preacher who went out to preach in a little country church, and it was in the dead of winter, and they had a big snowstorm. And only one person showed up to hear him preach, a farmer. And the preacher said, I guess we better just skip the service. And said, no, wait a minute, Pastor. He said, whenever I go out to feed the cows, if only one cow shows up, I go ahead and feed it. So the minister got up, commenced to preach, and he went on for about 2 hours. Finally, the farmer interrupted, and he says, oh, just a minute, Pastor. He said, it's true, I always feed the cow if there's only one that shows up, but I don't give her a whole load of hay. Now, Ed is from the Los Angeles area, and of course we know they have a lot of automobiles out there. That's where all the gasoline's going, I guess. There was a man went out one time to Los Angeles, and he checked in at a motel. And he said to the motel clerk, he said, tell me, I understand you have a lot of automobiles here. And he says, yes, we have several million. He says, well, when would be a safe time to take a walk? He says, I'd like to take a walk. He said, well, Sunday morning would be the best time. He said, all the Catholics are in church, and all the Protestants are in bed, and all the Jews are down at Palm Springs. So the man got up bright and early and went out for a walk and got run over by a Seventh-day Adventist. Now, Ed Rowe is in the work of the Christian Freedom Foundation and is working to apply Christian principles to the field of economics, the field that I'm personally very much interested in because we have pioneered in developing a Christian approach, economics in the Christian day school movement, and quite successfully. I've been reading Christian economics, which is now called Applied Christianity. For many, many years, it was one of my first introductions to conservative thought, and I appreciate the work that Dr. Kirshner and Mr. Rowe and others have been doing. Mr. Rowe is the president of the Christian Freedom Foundation and the editor of Applied Christianity, and also he has other publications. 2.5 years ago, Mr. Rowe founded a national youth paper called For Real. This unique paper, which has achieved a national circulation of 100,000, presents a Christian and American perspective on the controversial issues of our times. It seeks to counteract the flood of subversive and obscene literature on American campuses, and we certainly wish them well for this work. And then 2 years ago, Mr. Rowe also founded Moral Advance as a division of the Christian Freedom Foundation. Moral Advance is a practical program designed to combat abortion, euthanasia, pornography, and immorality in television and the theater. Moral Advance releases a free monthly bulletin which is called Moral Advance Action News. Now today Mr. Rowe is going to speak to us on the superiority of free enterprise. You know, about a year ago, Ed, I heard the Secretary of Agriculture, Mr. Butts, give a talk down at the National War College, and he summarized economics very well for us, the old classical definition, 9 words: there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And then later in the course of his speech, he proceeded to tell us how they were developing further the federal lunch program. Well, our speaker today is for real, and he's going to stick by that good definition of economics. Now, the subject today reminds me of a story I read some years ago about a Russian and American who visited each other's countries. And the American first went to visit the communist in Russia, and they went to a large factory. And the American said, who owns the land on which this factory is placed? And the Russian beamed with pride and he said, we the people. Then the American said, well, who owns this factory? And the Russian beamed, we the people. Well, he said, who owns all the tools in this factory? We the people. Then the American noticed that there were 3 automobiles parked nearby, and he said, well, who owns these automobiles? Well, he said, one of them belongs to the head of the secret police, one belongs to the chairman of the Communist Party, and the other one belongs to a state planner. Well, then they came over to the United States, and the American was showing his Russian friend around, and they went to a big factory in Detroit, and the Russian said, well, who owns the land here? He says, well, Henry Ford. He said, well, who owns this factory? Henry Ford. He said, well, who owns all the tools here in this factory? Well, Henry Ford. And then they looked out and they saw a parking lot with thousands of automobiles. And the Russian said, well, who owns all those automobiles? And the American said, we the people. I present to you Mr. H. Edward Rowe.
Reverend Robert Thoburn, Miss McKinney, Colonel Bunker, ladies and gentlemen. America is a free enterprise miracle. In fact, it is the most phenomenal free enterprise miracle in the history of the world. Building on the foundations laid by the colonists before them, the founders of our nation constructed out of the raw wilderness of North America the greatest nation in history. How was it possible for a new nation, without the advantage of the tools of trade and industry developed in the old world, to rise to such a high level of power and influence within the span of 150 years? How did this infant nation grow so rapidly to exceed the power and wealth of France, of Germany, and Great Britain? Nations that had learned the lessons of civilization from Greece and Rome. Nations that had been founded on the established traditions of 1,000 years. The secret of America's phenomenal ascendancy to the headship of nations was the unreserved dedication of her people to the spiritual and moral principles which underlie freedom. It was their view that freedom is not a gift to be granted by kings and tyrants if they wish to grant it, but that freedom is a direct right of man derived from Almighty God Himself. Never before in the history of the world had such a flood tide of spiritual faith cast off the chains of tyranny and fashioned the institutions of freedom. This was the soil in which America grew. Freedom was the seed plot of her great destiny. The year 1776 was an extremely important year in the history of mankind. We remember that year especially for the signing of the Declaration of Independence by representatives of the 13 North American colonies. But there was another great event which occurred in that year which is too often forgotten, even by conservatives. I refer to the publication of a monumental volume entitled The Wealth of Nations by a man named Adam Smith. Who was Adam Smith? Adam Smith was professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And in publishing this great book, he became the father of a new field of human concern known as economics. At the same time, because The Wealth of Nations formulated the principles of economic freedom, Adam Smith became the great architect of the philosophy of free enterprise. Now, it has always been the natural inclination of men to engage in free exchange. Men are naturally free enterprisers, and Adam Smith did not invent free enterprise, but he did formulate and systematize the principles of free enterprise as this had never been done before. The importance of Adam Smith to the cause of free enterprise can hardly be overestimated. His biographer, Dr. E.G. West, said this in his book on Adam Smith. He said, in many ways, Adam Smith belongs as much to America as does Thomas Jefferson. And he referred to these two great men, Adam Smith and Thomas Jefferson, as two great champions in the same cause, the cause of freedom. Now let us reverse the clock of history for a few moments and turn the clock back almost 200 years to have a look at the economic climate in which Adam Smith lived and wrote his great book. The economy of England in those days was a controlled economy, a rigidly controlled economy. Trade walls, tariffs, and barriers of all kinds had been erected by the politicians. Their economic policy was known as mercantilism. Mercantilism. It was based on the erroneous assumption that the economic enrichment of England could only take place through economic policies designed to impoverish other nations, and especially the colonies of England, particularly the North American colonies. In his great book, Adam Smith directed a frontal attack against the official policy of the English crown. He struck a mighty blow against the whole idea that an economy should be controlled by government bureaucrats. His influence was tremendous. He made a great impact in Europe, and his influence overflowed the bounds of Europe and planted the seeds of freedom and free enterprise in the fertile soil of North America. Dr. Ludwig von Mises, in his great book entitled The Anti-Capitalistic Mentality, paid tribute to Adam Smith and other early free enterprise economists in these words: the emergence of economics as a branch of knowledge was one of the most portentous events in the history of mankind. In paving the way for private capitalistic enterprise, it transformed within a few generations all human affairs more radically than the previous 10,000 years had done. Now, what is economics? Simply stated, economics is the study of the production and distribution of goods and services in a human society. What then is free enterprise? Well, free enterprise is simply an economic policy which permits freedom of choice and freedom of decision throughout the whole process of producing and distributing goods and services in society, with one major limitation, and that is the moral limitation. Our freedom of decision and choice is circumscribed by moral considerations. We are not free to engage in fraud, breach of contract, theft, or any other such thing. And when these things are engaged in too much and too long by too many people, freedom goes. It cannot exist under those circumstances. The pillars of free enterprise are private property, constitutionally limited government, and the sovereignty of the consumer. Free enterprise means that the supply and demand processes of the open market are superior to state planners when it comes to allocating resources and producing goods and distributing those goods. Now, my friends, let us face one significant fact today. Free enterprise is under attack in our time as never before in history. Beginning in 1854, when Karl Marx gave it the smear word capitalism, the followers of Marx and other atheists, humanists, and pseudo-intellectuals have developed a mighty counter-movement designed to discredit and defeat free enterprise. The basic platform of these enemies of freedom is spelled out in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. In this so-called manifesto, Karl Marx recommended a 10-point program for the extension of communism into the most advanced countries of the world. 7 of these 10 points have already been largely implemented in the United States of America. Briefly calling attention to them, they are as follows. We have a heavy progressive or graduated income tax today. To a large degree, the right of inheritance has been abridged by means of the inheritance tax. The confiscation of property is taking place through our policies of confiscatory taxation. Our Federal Reserve System fulfills to a very large degree that provision of the Communist Manifesto which called for the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly, using the words of Marx. Fifth, we are witnessing a powerful trend toward the centralization of the means of transportation and communication through the federal regulatory agencies. In the 6th place, our federal government is already encroaching on private sector production capacity through the government ownership and control of hundreds of corporations. And 7th, to a very large degree, we have provided free education for all children in public schools. Words quoted right out of the Communist Manifesto. Now let's pause on that point for just a moment and ask ourselves, why did Karl Marx want free public education? Well, because he knew that this would be a powerful weapon for the destruction of freedom and particularly property values and free enterprise. What is the situation today? From coast to coast, our educational system is largely devoted to the destruction of free enterprise capitalism. Probably 90% of our economics and political science departments have been taken over by Marxists. A very large percentage of the 28 million young people in our public high schools and colleges are being taught that free enterprise is evil and unjust. As Henry Hazlitt has observed, capitalism is being maligned, thwarted, sabotaged, and slowly regulated to death. In a speech delivered before the Congress of American Industry in New York City on December 8, 1972, the governor of California, the Honorable Ronald Reagan, related the following incident. He said there was a student at a university in one of our middle Atlantic states who canceled the course on history after he had purchased the textbook and taken a look at it. Now notice, the first line of this textbook, which was entitled Up Against the America Myth, read as follows: "Capitalism stinks. We can only solve our social problems by doing away with capitalism and the institutions that support it." And Governor Reagan apparently had looked at this book because he said there were 458 pages of that kind of talk. And he quoted from page 439 where it said, "It is only through developing and expanding socialist rationality that the advanced industrial countries can hope to overcome the ills of society." That is the kind of thing that is being fed to our kids in the public schools and universities and colleges. Only the very blindest observer today can deny the effectiveness of the concerted attack against the free enterprise system which has been mounted by its enemies in our time. The program of the enemies of free enterprise has been so tragically effective that already we are hearing the death rattle of a once free economy. The ominous symptoms of economic disease and pain are upon us today. Just notice these facts. Our paper dollar is probably worth 35% of a 1940 dollar. A wave of government-induced inflation is robbing Americans who have savings, life insurance, and other investments of $100 billion of their wealth this year. Confidence in the dollar is languishing abroad, and we have already been faced into two major recent devaluations. More are bound to follow. Our currency is debased and our credit is debauched. We are forbidden to own gold, and our silver coins are actually copper ones overspread with a veneer of respectability. Under the management of our federal government and central banking system, we have become the greatest economic phonies in the history of the world. Our gross total public and private debt has skyrocketed to $5.5 trillion. According to Dr. Franz Pick, one of the world's leading authorities on currency and gold, the two most recent devaluations alone amount to about 18% and have wiped out more than $1 trillion worth of the savings of our citizens who had purchased bonds, life insurance, and annuities. And Dr. Pick says these people were simply cheated without compensation. And he sounds this warning, quote, "If we continue to do this, we are going to ruin the United States of America and drift into dictatorship." I tell you, my friends, a frustrating sense of fear and desperation engulfs us nationally right at this moment. The enemies of free enterprise have a stranglehold on our economy, And the question confronting us now, the real question is, can we survive? But out of this dark picture, there emerges a ray of light. The steadfast confidence of an active minority of our people in the superiority of free enterprise. Just as Adam Smith, who stood alone against the entrenched powers of economic control in his time, and who won the day for freedom, a remnant of Americans can do the same today. A small army of strong and brave citizens like you, friends, armed with the truth, knowledgeable in economics, and dedicated to the principles of freedom, can turn the tide. You know, the majority never did rule. It is always an active minority that gets on top sooner or later. The main weapon in our arsenal must be an unswerving, unchangeable confidence in the superiority of free enterprise. Now, what is the basis of this confidence? Three powerful factors combine to compose the platform upon which this confidence in the superiority of free enterprise is constructed. In the first place, free enterprise is superior because it imposes strict limitations on the scope and power of government, and thereby tends to assure political liberty. Now listen very carefully for a moment. Property is power. Just think about it. A unit of property is a unit of power. If you can visualize a society in which all property is owned by a central government, then you will find that that is a society in which all power is centralized in the hands of the government. This situation, of course, is approximated under fascism, Nazism, socialism, communism, and all systems of totalitarianism. The greater the concentration of ownership or control of property under the authority of the state, the greater will be its power over the people. On the other hand, where property is widely dispersed and diffused and scattered throughout a society, both individually and corporately, the power is also widely dispersed and diffused and scattered about throughout the economy. A free enterprise system is a private property system, and this ownership of property by millions of citizens is a powerful force tending to limit or restrict the growth and power of government. And I tell you, I believe today, if it had not been for the tradition of free enterprise in America, the bureaucrats would already have us entirely under their control as of this moment. Now, economic freedom is the most basic of all freedoms next to spiritual freedom itself. It is the natural inclination of man to strive, to work, to accumulate, to own, to invest, to build, to exchange, and to trade. Collectively, this normal human impulse is one of the most irresistible forces for freedom that can possibly be imagined. It is so powerful that no government can conquer it. No bureaucracy can banish it, and no state can suppress it permanently. In a pamphlet entitled The Economics of a Free Society, William Benton, the publisher of Encyclopedia Britannica, made a great statement relative to the influence of free enterprise on government. Here are his words. A free market open to the development of new independent enterprises will continue to provide an economic basis for political freedom. Such a market breeds the millions of rival producers and sellers who do not need to cater to public or private overlords. They help keep the balance on the side of freedom and against the arbitrary exercise of economic power. They provide the competition that minimizes the need for government regulation and operation, end of quote. I think all of us realize that in many nations of the world today, free enterprise, properly understood, is strictly forbidden. Those are countries in which unrestrained government imposes itself upon the people. But the American idea is totally the reverse of that. America is a reaction against all-powerful government. This is the basic idea of our nation. America holds that the will of the people is to be imposed upon government. And this can be done only as the people develop, individually and corporately, the units of property, wealth, and power which are the natural outcome of the practice of free enterprise. Free enterprise is superior because it is the only economic system which tends to dissipate and restrain the greatest enemy of man, oversized government. In the second place, coming now to my second point, the second of three major points, free enterprise is superior because it is vastly more productive than the systems designed by the state planners under socialism and communism. Now we might ask the question, why is free enterprise more productive? Well, because it stimulates men to action. It unleashes human energy, and it draws the very best human talent into the service of mankind. And I think this was one of the most basic premises of the great book written by Adam Smith. If you haven't read that book, it is rather ponderous, but it would be well worth your time to wade through it. Why is free enterprise more productive than planned economic systems? Because the free market supply and demand mechanism is the very best computer that ever existed. Through this mechanism, thousands of resources are allocated for productive purposes, and vast quantities of human and mechanical energy are focused on the right resources in the right way and at the right time for the production of the goods and services that the masses of the people desire and for which they vote with their dollars when they spend their money in the market. Now, socialist economic systems are baffled, boggled, and buffaloed because they cannot possibly solve the problem of economic calculation. The calculation of what resources should be used at what time and in what way and in what place. Imagine, if you will, a small committee of socialist economic planners sitting down around a table as so many chess players, setting out to decide on the movements and to control the movements of 100 billion factors of production and distribution. You know, it's quite a job they take on when they set out to control an economy. And I tell you, it just doesn't work. It never has worked, and it never will work. It cannot possibly work. And that is precisely why the socialist communist governments of East Europe and Russia have been compelled in their economic life to retreat from their previous attempt to fulfill the utopian dream of Karl Marx in accordance with the revolutionary handbook which he wrote. I'm going to give you some astounding facts from U.S. News and World Report. I refer to an article entitled "Why the Reds Are Turning to Capitalism." Now, that's kind of a surprise headline in U.S. News and World Report, isn't it? But it occurred not so long ago, and of course I was enticed into a careful reading of what was said under that caption. It said that private enterprise is staging a comeback in much of East Europe. Little by little, the communist governments are opening the door for private ownership, and the results far outstrip what has been achieved by the communist bureaucrats whose original goal was to run everything. And this article goes on to tell of a, quote, resurgence of private enterprise in these communist countries. 14 million people in 7 European communist nations are now earning a living without being collectivized or drawing paychecks from the state. Hundreds of thousands of others are moonlighting, legally or illegally, with private business activities in addition to their government jobs. Poland has 5.5 million private farmers. East Germany officially leaves loopholes for non-governmental businessmen and lets some of them get rich. 2/3 of Hungary's new housing is built by private interests. In many instances throughout Eastern Europe, businesses which were losing concerns under government ownership have been converted to profit-making ventures in less than a year. 15,000 Romanian entrepreneurs are doing business of one kind or another outside the law. You see this tremendous compulsion on the part of people to practice free enterprise, and you know there's a tremendous black market in all of these communist countries. But I have news for the communist bosses. The black market is the true market. It is the free market. Well, just a couple of other amazing facts. Yugoslavia has 6 million private farmers and 200,000 small private businesses. And private enterprise is boosting tremendously Soviet farm production. You know, they couldn't even exist as a nation without private enterprise in Russia. 1/3 of all of the farm products produced in Russia come not from the collective farms, from the state agricultural enterprises, but from the private gardens and pastures which the peasants are allowed to tend on their own time. Imagine it, graciously allowed to do a little bit of free economic activity. And the pity of this whole thing, my friends, is that the communist totalitarian lid is still on. And it is only within a little framework that is permitted by the sovereign tyrannical state that they're able to practice, but they are tightly circumscribed. And the police state is still there, and it is all pervading throughout the Soviet Union today. But just think of the dynamic force of free men who desire to be free and who will practice, regardless of what any government says, who will practice private enterprise. And this is precisely because of this dynamic force that has been noticed in Russia and the other communist countries that they have been compelled to retreat and to permit a measure of free economic activity. No government has ever been able to compete with private interests in terms of productive efficiency. According to a National Federation of Independent Business release, the United Parcel Service was one time permitted in selected areas to operate in direct competition with the U.S. Postal Services in this country. And I dug out a couple of facts which I thought were significant. When a comparative study was made, they found that the cost of shipping a 5-pound package between San Francisco and Seattle under the federal postal system was 94 cents, whereas the United Parcel Service, an independent operation, operating under the principles of free private enterprise, sent the same package of the same size and weight, the same distance, for a price of 74 cents. Now notice this, though. The delivery time for the U.S. Postal Service was 7 to 10 days. The delivery time under United Parcel was 2 days. I was told that there is a gentleman from the Boston Globe here today, and I would like to give him some interesting information about this city of Boston. Maybe he could give me some information, too. Now, I got this out of the New York Times, if you'll accept that as a reliable forum for this type of thing. According to the New York Times, this city of Boston once offered municipal garbage pickup services in residential areas. But they made a study of the whole situation and found that it was not economically feasible to do so. And so beginning way back in the 30s and concluding in 1949, they transferred that type of service to private enterprise. San Francisco went through a very similar transition. Both of these cities maintain that they are far better off with private enterprise than they ever were under the municipal operation. Now let's talk about New York City for just a moment. It was only a couple of years ago that New York City studied the possibility of turning the garbage collection detail over to private enterprise. When the comparative study was made, it turned up an amazing fact. Private firms could collect garbage in New York for $17.50 a ton, less than 1/3 what it was costing the municipal service to do the same thing. And incidentally, the private firms were making a profit, too. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard of Mr. Richard DeVos of the Amway Corporation, a very great American patriot. I wish he could hear that applause. I think he would realize that he has some friends in this group, and I'm sure in many patriotic groups across the country. I heard Mr. DeVos make a speech some years ago to some of his distributors. I was invited as a guest down in the Philadelphia area. And he made in that speech an almost classic statement comparing the productivity of the United States and Russia. And in that speech, he told what the American people would have to do in order to move backward to a standard of living comparable to that which prevails in the Soviet Union. And I was so impressed that I wrote for a copy of his speech, and I have taken this paragraph out of it. I think it is a gem. Here are his words. We would have to abandon, in order to be comparable to the standard of living in Russia, we in America would have to abandon 3/5 of our steel capacity, 2/3 of our petroleum output, and 95% of our electric motor output. We would have to destroy 2 out of every 3 of our hydroelectric plants and get along on 1/10 of our volume of natural gas. We would have to rip up 14 of every 15 miles of our paved highways and get rid of 2 out of every 3 miles of our railroad tracks. We would have to scrap 19 out of every 20 automobiles and trucks and destroy 40 million television sets, which might be a good idea, by the way. One of the things we are doing in our Moral Advance program is combating immorality on television. And if you ever watch the tube, you know that it's coming in like a flood this very season that is just passed, and more is planned for next season, and I understand worse. This final fact given by Richard DeVos: in order to be comparable to the Soviet Union, we would have to move 60 million people back on the farms and lock up millions in slave labor camps, end of quote. Friends, the incomparable productive capacity of our relatively free economy speaks very eloquently for the superiority of human freedom and enterprise. Only free enterprise appeals to the very best in man and brings forth a maximum of his creative energy. Now to my third and final main point. We affirm the superiority of free enterprise because of its proven ability to solve social problems more effectively than any other economic system. The liberal press in our country is always trumpeting two social problems which it considers to be crucial: the racial problem and the poverty problem. They claim that people are being discriminated against and that they are being locked into pockets of poverty due to the evils of our free enterprise capitalistic economic system. Now, as far as the racial problem is concerned, the free enterprise system is the only system of which it can be truthfully said that it cannot afford to discriminate against people racially or in accordance with their faith or creed or ethnic relationships of any kind. It has been said that free enterprise is colorblind simply because in a competitive system, a businessman is compelled to employ the person who can produce the most and the most efficiently. Not to do so because of racial prejudice or any other prejudice of that kind is to commit business suicide. Now, the members of racial minorities in America who feel that they are getting a bad deal had better place the blame right where it belongs, either on themselves for not working hard enough or else on the government itself. Too much government and too little economic freedom. Racial discrimination is a greater threat in a country in which too much power is concentrated in the hands of too few people. The bureaucrats who hold the power are not compelled by economic forces to overlook racial factors in order to be successful, as is the case in free enterprise. When Professor Milton Friedman, the University of Chicago economist, was put on the spot in an interview about racial discrimination in America, he replied with these words, quote, "What country in the world today engages in the most extreme anti-Semitic persecution?" And he answered his own question, the Soviet Union. And he added, "It's not an accident, because if you have a society with concentrated power, if you have a collectivist society, it's going to be in a position to exercise the preferences and prejudices of its rulers. Moreover, it's going to have an incentive to do so because it's going to need a scapegoat. And it will choose some group like the Jews or the blacks to be its scapegoats." And then Dr. Friedman, who, as you know, is Jewish, added these words. He said, "I personally have been very sensitive to this issue because I'm Jewish. And I'm very much aware of the history of anti-Semitism. One of the paradoxes which I puzzle over is that few people in the world have benefited as much as the Jews from free enterprise capitalism and competition, and yet few other groups," says this Jewish economist, "few other groups have done so much to undermine it intellectually." Now, I want it clear that Dr. Friedman said that and not Ed Rowe. Turning now to the poverty problem. Here again, Dr. Friedman has given us some very interesting figures. He says the average income of blacks in America is far higher than the average income of all the people in the Soviet Union. He says the official government definition of the poverty line in the United States is higher than the average income in the Soviet Union. And he says it is higher than the income that is received by 90% of the people on the surface of this globe. That's the poverty line in America. Any unbiased student of history must conclude that free enterprise is the most effective weapon ever directed against the persistent human problem of poverty. On May 7, 1967, Governor Lester Maddox was interviewed on the national NBC forum Meet the Press. And I happened to be watching. Were any of you watching on that occasion? Well, maybe you'll remember when I quote what was said here. Anyway, in the course of the interview, Mr. Claude Sitton of the New York Times, there goes the Times again, put this question to Governor Maddox. And he said it with a rather pompous air. He said, "Governor, what steps are you taking on the state level to alleviate poverty in Georgia?" The reply given by Governor Maddox to this representative of the liberal press and to the American people is, I think, an almost classic statement of the confidence of our people in the ability of free enterprise to conquer poverty. Here is what he said: to alleviate poverty in Georgia, the governor of Georgia said, we are promoting the free enterprise system, states' rights, private property rights, and education. It is through this free enterprise system that you can have the economic justice that is needed, and not through a centralized government telling the states, telling the businesses, telling the firms, telling the people, telling those in health, telling those in education when to get up, where to go to the doctor, and where to go to school. The words of Governor Maddox. Probably the most powerful statement of the real truth concerning the poverty issue which has come to us in this generation is in the form of a great book by Henry Hazlitt entitled The Conquest of Poverty. Henry Hazlitt, as you know, is a very eminent economist, the author of many, many books. Economics in One Lesson, I think, is his best known, most widely distributed book. In my opinion, Henry Hazlitt's new book on the conquest of poverty is by all odds the best researched, most comprehensive, most readable, and best presented volume on the subject of poverty that has appeared within the last 50 years. And if you don't have it, it's an Arlington House book. You ought to get hold of it and read it. It is documented all the way through. And I just wish someone at one of the booths had a supply available. Does anyone have a supply? I haven't seen any, and I've been looking for them. A tremendous book. This book is profound in its grasp of the real issue underlying poverty, and in a very masterful way. It discusses the problem of poverty in historical perspective. Listen carefully, my friends. This is important. Henry Hazlitt gathers massive evidence that anti-poverty schemes that are funded by expropriation of wealth actually tend to bring impoverishment in any society. And on the other hand, he proves that private ownership and control of the resources and tools of production creates a climate favorable to the greatest development and distribution of wealth. Hazlitt says this: the history of poverty is almost the history of mankind. The ancient writers have left us few specific accounts of it. They simply took it for granted. Poverty, he says, was the normal lot of people everywhere throughout the ancient world. In the long sweep of history, Hazlitt points out, it has been the system known as free enterprise that has been responsible for the conquest of poverty. And Hazlitt pays tribute to free enterprise in these very choice words. Listen. It is this system which has lifted mankind out of mass poverty. It is this system that in the last century, in the last generation, even in the last decade, has acceleratively been changing the face of the world and has provided the masses of mankind with amenities that even kings did not possess or imagine a few generations ago. Capitalism, says Hazlitt, capitalism in the advanced countries has already conquered mass poverty, as that was known throughout human history. And then he says this: capitalism will continue to eliminate mass poverty in more and more places and to an increasingly marked extent if it is merely permitted to do so. There is no doubt, my friends, that the trend in our time is to look to socialism as the answer to poverty. This is the intellectual fashion of our time in government circles, in education, in economics, in political science, and even to a very amazing degree in religion and business. As television commentator Jeffrey St. John has put it, quote, I believe that totalitarian ideas have taken root in the minds of intellectuals everywhere. The feeling has become widespread in America that the capitalists are the cruel and heartless people. And the good guys are people like Michael Harrington and John Kenneth Galbraith and others who want an ever-enlarging paternalistic government to take over the problem of poverty and solve it just like that. And instead, they are simply creating poverty with those policies. Well, in answer to this trend of thought, Professor Milton Friedman has stated a well-demonstrated truth when he said, I think the government solution to a problem is worse than the problem itself. Concerning the hope that's of so many people that government can solve the poverty problem, Friedman, who has researched poverty backward and forward and up and down for years, he has studied thoroughly every government poverty program that has ever existed, pronounced this conclusion. He said the actual outcome of almost all programs that are sold in the name of helping the poor is to make the poor worse off. You can take one program after another and demonstrate that this is the fact. In a recent Brookings Institution report, the authors of Great Society programs, such as the War on Poverty, now admit that those programs spent a lot of money but accomplished very little except to create employment for a lot of anti-poverty workers. The famous Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, who was the author of a novel that was widely distributed in America, The Brothers Karamazov, lived in Russia in the years 1821 to 1881. As you know, it was during those years that Karl Marx was living and writing, and the new Marxist philosophy was spreading out in intellectual circles. And Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, had an opportunity to study in great depth the Marxist philosophy. He was very much interested in doing something about it, in saying something significant about it, because so many people were placing hope in this new savior, this new socialist, Marxist, communist monster that was arising upon the scene in his day. And so Dostoevsky put it briefly and bluntly in these words: the future kingdom of socialism will be a terrible tyranny of criminals and murderers. It will throw humanity into a true hell of spiritual suffering and poverty. Ladies and gentlemen, those who believe in freedom must hold the line today against socialistic thought and action. Free enterprise is by all odds the most powerful force in history for the conquest of poverty. The only permanent cure for poverty is production. As a Warner and Well, if you like that, here's another one, and I got this out of a Warner and Swayze magazine ad. Some of you have read those delightful free enterprise-oriented advertisements which appear in national publications. Here it is: the greatest war on poverty is a successful corporation. Well, now, by way of conclusion, any sane assessment of the economic realities of our time forces us to conclude that free enterprise is struggling for survival. Threatened by the socialistic ideology, the excessive demands of government-created labor monopolies, unprecedented government spending, inflation, devaluation, price controls, the regulatory agencies of government, the calculated manipulations of the Federal Reserve Board, the consumerism fad, and the climate of outright hostility to business, the real danger is that free enterprise will be swept away as it was in the Roman Empire. And if this happens, our freedoms will be tragically lost in a dark night of totalitarianism. The immutable record of history is ours. It is for our wisdom and guidance, and it declares with the irrefutable force of truth that free enterprise is far superior to all totalitarian economic systems. It is superior because it tends to limit the power of government. It is superior because it is vastly more productive than any system which the planners can devise. It is superior by virtue of its proven ability to solve social problems like the racial and poverty problems more effectively than any other economic system. But having said this, I must add the following. Far more important than the practical performance of free enterprise is the fact that it is based on the property system established by Almighty God when he told Israel and the world through Moses, "Thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not steal." Believing in the free... I think most of you got the implications of the quotation of that scripture, because socialism is essentially a system of legislated covetousness and theft. Believing in free enterprise without reservation, as we in this room do, let us research and write and speak and teach and publish and shout its values and its virtues as long as we shall live through every medium of communications and education that is available to us. The principles of the American Revolution, which have been responsible for our rise to greatness as a nation, are as true as ever before if we remain faithful to these principles. And if we are steadfast and energetic in the pursuit of them, our cause will ultimately triumph. My friends, this is a cause which must triumph, because these timeless principles of property, of liberty and enterprise have come to us from none other than the sovereign God of this universe himself. Thank you very much.